Good morning, first graders. This morning we're going to have a virtual book club. We are going to read The King of the Frogs for a second time, paying special attention to one of the characters. Can anyone remember some of the characters in the story? We read it for the first time before break. That's right. There is a wise old frog, the great god Mni, and Mamba the Crocodile. Good work. I want you all to listen carefully as I read. I'll ask you some questions, and I want you to pay special attention to descriptions of the great god Mni. Remember, it's like Rumi with an The King of the Frogs. Have you ever been beside a lake in Africa at night and listened to the frogs? You haven't. Then you cannot imagine what the noise is like. Do you remember our frog chorus from the other day? Think carefully about that, because that's just what it sounds like. And it's not just one kind of noise, it's several. Over there, for instance, are 1,000 creaking doors that have never had their hinges oiled. And someone opens and shuts them and keeps on doing just that. Creak, creak, creak. Over there are 1,000 fat men snoring, and no one wakes them up. Then there are 1,000 carpenters sawing planks, and all the saws want a touch of grease. What do sawing planks sound like? And 1,000 little bells are being struck, ring, ring, and 1,000 corks are being pulled out of bottles. Pop! Noise you can hardly hear yourself think. Then you go a little closer until you can just see the edge of the water, and perhaps a reed or two, and there is silence. Just the splash of a frog jumping into the water late because he was asleep and didn't hear you coming. Then nothing, and you can hear the whole world breathe. There's a story about this. Boys and girls, what happens when it's so quiet that you can hear the whole world breathe? Long ago, the frogs did as they pleased, and the result was dreadful. Not one of them would listen to what another said, and they all shouted at once. Children wouldn't obey their parents, and even wives wouldn't listen to their husbands, which is, indeed, something hardly to be understood. It was all noisy and untidy beyond bearing, and nothing ever got done. It was so messy that no one could stand it. At last, a wise old frog, this is one of our main characters, called everyone to a meeting and said, since he had a very fine voice and went on shouting for a long time, he managed to get them all there at once, for to tell you the truth, they were pretty sick of living the way they did. There's a picture of the wise old frog. Frogs, said the old frog, puffing himself up. We cannot go on like this. It's no sort of life for anyone. And, anyway, when you see how all the other creatures live, it makes one ashamed of being a frog. There is only one thing to do. We must get a king. When people have kings, there is peace and order, and everyone does as he is told. Would you agree with that, boys and girls? Would you agree that when there's a king, everyone does as they're told? Great answers. I can tell you really thought about that. Agreed, they all shouted, and they stayed long enough to commission the old frog to see what he could do about getting them one. Commission means to give someone a job. Before everyone fell to quarreling and pushing and splashing, and the meeting broke into disorder. As usual. Then the wise, wise old frog went to see the great god Mumi. You will say the two M's correctly if you hum a little before you begin the word. So pay attention now, because we are trying to listen for descriptions of the great god Mumi. Mumi happened to be in charge of that part of the world. He is a very slow god and usually gives people more than they bargained for. Based on that description, what kind of god do you think Mumi is? Interesting. He agreed drowsily that the frogs needed a king and promised to do something about it. Then he went to sleep again. He sounds kind of lazy to me. So the frogs went on as usual, which was badly, until one day Mumi woke up, remembered his promise, took a great green mossy boulder, which had the rough shape of a gigantic frog, and threw it into the water. Splash! That's a picture of Mumi throwing the rock into the water. There you are, he shouted. It sounded like thunder. There's your king. His name's Gogo, and like me, he doesn't want to be disturbed. Respect him and be satisfied. So, do you think Mumi gives the frog Gogo because Mumi is lazy, wise, or making fun of them? What do you think? The whole lake was shaken by Gogo's fall. The waves washed through the reeds and tore up the shore, and in the middle of a great cloud of mud, Gogo settled on the bottom, and fat green water weeds curled round and over him. He looked shocking. The frogs were terrified and fled under stones and into dark corners and holes under the bank. Their long white legs streamed behind them as they swam. Do you think that they looked like the frogs in our classroom? I think so. Parents found their children and husbands their wives, and then settled down to explaining what had happened. Here's a picture of Gogo settling to the bottom of the lake. This is our king, they said, and a fine, terrible one he seems, and from the splash he made not the sort to fool about with. Now all will be well, and this scandalous behavior will stop. And so it did, for a while. But although Gogo had made such a wonderful first impression, as time passed, they noticed that he never moved. He just sat quietly in the mud and stared in the same direction. Presently, they began to get used to him, until finally some young, bold, bad frogs ventured to swim close to him, and then one of them touched his nose. And still Gogo said and did nothing. Bah! He's not a king, they shouted. He's not even a frog. He's just an old stone and couldn't hurt anyone. And they swam round him until they were dizzy and jumped all over his back and went away and spoke rudely about him to their elders. Boys and girls, do you think that the young frogs are bad? Yes or no? They certainly seem to be a little mischievous. Mischievous means that they like to get into trouble. At first, none of the elders believed them. They had their children Gogo. They had told their children Gogo was a king, and a king he had to be. But soon it was impossible to deny that the children were right. And then, well, the noise began again, and things were as they had always been, only worse, terrible. The wise old frog sighed and set out to see Mumi again, who was not at all pleased at being woken a second time. So Mumi is not pleased about being woken up. He sounds very lazy to me. Here are some pictures of the wise old frog. He's frustrated when it gets louder, And finally he's had enough. "All right," he shouted in a passion. "All right, you aren't satisfied with the king I've given you? Is that the way it is? Very well, you shall have another one, and I hope you like him." And the very next day he gave them, do you remember who Mumi gave them? That's right, Mamba the Crocodile. Gogo had come to his people with a splash that shook the lake, but Mamba slid into the water with only a whisper and left but one small ring, spreading gently to show that he had come. Then he swam, silent as a shadow, lithe and long and secret, his jaws grinning like a trap. Gogo had never visited the people he had been given to rule, but Mamba visited them often and suddenly, and whenever he met a subject, the great jaws gaped and closed, and often it was the last of that frog. The frogs developed the greatest respect for their new king and lived quietly, looking over the backs of their heads, as frogs can do. Because where do frogs have their eyes? That's right, so they can look over the backs of their heads. Now and again, at night, they break out, but they keep their eyes open, and if you go near the lake, they shut up. They think that it's Mamba coming to put a little order into them, and they keep quiet. Does Mamba give the frogs Mamba for a king to punish them, or to make their life better? What do you think? Was the crocodile a punishment, or was he there to help them? Great thoughts. Great job paying attention to descriptions of the great god Mi. Now, what you can do at home, if you have a piece of paper, a pencil, and maybe even some colored pencils, you could think about some words to describe Mi. I chose the words tricky, lazy, and slow. And I used these words to draw a picture of what I thought the great god looked like. Because there's lots of pictures in our story, but there's no pictures of the great gods. So, if you have the time at home, try to draw a picture of what you think the great god looks like. And feel free to be creative, because there's not a lot of pictures of him. There's not a lot of descriptions of what he looks like. So I want you to decide what you think he looks like. Thanks, and happy drawing.